Good day to you. My name is Lourdes Inga. I'm Quechua descent from Peru, and I joined today from the ancestral lands of the Maibu and Nisenan peoples here in Northern California. I'm the Executive Director of International Funders for Indigenous Peoples, known as IFIP. To get us started, we have 3 or 4 amazing speakers who are going to go through sharing the findings of these really critical and important reports. But to open us, and we want to give a welcome to Sindis Meza, who is the Senior Program Officer of the Andean region for the Ford Foundation. Sindis' groundmaking focuses on strengthening the rights, power, and access of Afro-descendants, Indigenous communities, and other marginalized groups, with particular attention to gender issues. Sindis, if you could please help us by sharing some opening remarks.
Muy buenos días, muy buenas tardes y muy buenas noches en algunos sitios, de acuerdo con lo que vi. No, para nosotros es un placer estar en este espacio. Tenemos una relación con CARC, con el Centro de Investigación, el Consejo de Investigación del Caribe Centroamericano, desde hace un tiempo. En el año 2019, antes de la pandemia, tuvimos un encuentro en México para hablar precisamente de cómo estábamos apoyando y fortaleciendo el trabajo de las comunidades, de los pueblos indígenas, las comunidades afrodescendientes y las comunidades tradicionales. En ese sentido, luego vinieron varias reflexiones, sobre todo cuál era el rol nuestro en ese proceso de fortalecimiento y resiliencia de los pueblos indígenas, en el caso particular de esta conversación. Hoy tenemos el placer de poder decirles que hay un reporte global y del que van a escuchar mucho más durante este webinar, que es el reporte sobre ampliando el camino, una visión general del papel de la filantropía en el apoyo a los pueblos indígenas. Y yo creo que aquí hay varias cosas que son importantes. Una de las cosas que yo resalto como importante es que muestra con datos este reporte y cuánto es el aporte que la filantropía privada en los casos de estudio da a los pueblos indígenas directamente. Cómo se usan, por ejemplo, la figura de intermediarios o otra clase de organizaciones no gubernamentales o sin ánimos de lucro para apoyar el trabajo de los pueblos indígenas. Y adicionalmente, cómo estamos trabajando y qué agendas estamos apoyando. Y yo creo que las recomendaciones van en 2 vías. Por un lado, es resaltar dónde están los temas, las oportunidades, los retos en ese apoyo a los pueblos indígenas. Pero al mismo tiempo, resaltan cuál es nuestra labor. Y yo creo que hay varias cosas en la labor, por ejemplo, de la filantropía privada. Uno es cómo aprendemos a construir esas relaciones interculturales, esas relaciones diferenciales con los pueblos indígenas y cómo ampliamos nuestra visión para tener una mirada mucho más holística de los temas que están trabajando y la manera en cómo nosotros estamos apoyando ese trabajo. En ese sentido, yo creo que este reporte es muy útil y es muy útil tanto para la agenda de incidencia de advocacy de los pueblos indígenas propiamente, para mostrar datos concretos de cómo se están realizando los apoyos, pero también en qué temas se están apoyando y cuáles siguen siendo las brechas en esos apoyos, acompañamientos que hace la filantropía privada. Y por el otro lado, es un poco de cómo se construyen esas relaciones. O sea, esas relaciones yo creo que el reporte es claro en afirmar que ha ido evolucionando y es una relación que pasó por muchas etapas. Incluso se atreve a decir en algunos apartes que hay unas etapas donde el tema del desarrollismo, el tema del indigenismo, eran como el punto central de esos apoyos. Pero luego hay una evolución y yo creo que estamos en un mundo en cambio. Y un mundo en cambio que nos presenta retos. Es decir, es un mundo que apela dentro de nuestras democracias a un tema de la homogeneidad o un tema de la igualdad formal. Lo que significa que frente a eso, el tema de los derechos de los pueblos indígenas sigue estando en tensión con esas concepciones. Y lo que a nosotros desde la filantropía nos pone retos adicionales en poder tener una comprensión mejor de lo que está sucediendo, pero adicionalmente de lo que podemos apoyar. Y yo creo que en el caso de los pueblos indígenas existe una agenda amplísima, que es una agenda que no es una agenda nueva o reciente después de la pandemia, sino una agenda que ha existido, pero después de la pandemia esas desigualdades preexistentes se han agudizado. Entonces vemos que existe la declaración de los derechos, la declaración de los pueblos indígenas, donde se hace el reconocimiento de los derechos de los pueblos indígenas en sus derechos como sujeto colectivo y los derechos colectivos que tienen. Vemos unos avances en materia legislativa, sobre todo en temas de tratados internacionales, por ejemplo, con el Tratado 169 de la OIT, y también vemos todo el tema del cuestionamiento de cuál ha sido, por ejemplo, el protagonismo de las mujeres indígenas y sus organizaciones en proceso de cambio en relación con los pueblos indígenas y la relación con otros actores, por ejemplo, la filantropía. Y ese también es un llamado a nosotros en el tema de cómo promovemos mejor la diversidad, la equidad y la inclusión en el trabajo que hacemos. Y adicionalmente, cómo nos sectorizamos, es decir, cómo no tenemos una visión un poco un poco parcial o una visión un poco dividida de cuáles son esas agendas. Y hay muchas cosas que la filantropía puede hacer. Y yo creo que con esta concepción, con los mínimos de derechos de los pueblos indígenas, sobre todo el tema de autonomías, autodeterminación, nuestro trabajo debe enfocarse en tratar de co-crear y construir esas agendas, pero adicionalmente saber dónde tenemos un mayor impacto. Y existen todavía muchos, como digo, brechas en seguridad jurídica, especialmente en el tema de tierra y titulación, en gestión sostenible de los recursos naturales, sobre todo en la idea de desarrollo o cosmovisión desde el desarrollo desde los pueblos indígenas, en fortalecer la participación de los espacios organizativos y toma de decisiones y políticas públicas, implementación de esas políticas públicas para los pueblos indígenas, la identidad y el reconocimiento como parte esencial de la pervivencia y la supervivencia de los pueblos indígenas. Es algo que nosotros siempre ponemos como en segundo plano, pero que es central dentro de este trabajo. Derechos como la consulta, el consentimiento, en algunos casos la consulta previa, libre e informada, que son fundamentales en la autonomía y la autodeterminación, todo el tema del sujeto de derecho colectivo, la autoidentificación étnica, las jurisdicciones especiales indígenas, y yo creo que un sinnúmero de temas que guardan relación con esos derechos reconocidos en la declaración, pero además en otros tratados internacionales, en las legislaciones de los países. Yo creo que esta va a ser una buena reflexión para seguir, para que ustedes nos sigan mostrando cuál ha sido nuestro rol como filantropía privada, pero también en dónde están esas brechas, esas oportunidades y los retos, y adicionalmente tener como visiones de acuerdo con las regiones. Ahí existen diferencias geográficas evidentes en ese trabajo, en algunos casos asimetrías que se pueden ver entre mayor incidencia o no de procesos organizativos en los pueblos indígenas, pero yo creo que existen lugares comunes. Y por ejemplo, este foro va a ser una oportunidad para tener ese reporte global, pero al mismo tiempo para que se converse sobre filantropía y pueblos indígenas y comunidades en África, que es un reporte específico para esa zona, tejiendo y construyendo las relaciones en Asia, el camino cuesta arriba, las relaciones de la filantropía con los pueblos indígenas en América Latina. Y yo creo que esas diferencias geográficas son muy importantes para saber cómo tenemos en el caso de la filantropía una lectura geográfica, pero también una lectura global. Y el reporte global sobre esa visión general del papel de la filantropía es clave. Entonces, desde la Fundación Ford creemos que tenemos un rol. Por un lado, creemos que debemos seguir aprendiendo sobre este trabajo, pero por el otro, yo creo que también es cómo continuamos apoyando el trabajo de los pueblos indígenas desde esas miradas diferenciales, pero también cómo seguimos promoviendo que otros actores de la filantropía puedan incluir esas visiones diferenciales en el trabajo que hacen y apoyar no solamente agendas específicas, sino procesos a largo plazo que implican construir relaciones, y esas relaciones que implican para tener un mayor impacto en ese trabajo. Entonces, una de las grandes preguntas que nos hacemos en Ford es ¿y cómo cambiamos las reglas del juego en temas de dinámicas de poder? ¿Cómo generamos cambios estructurales y sistémicos? ¿Cómo cambiar las dinámicas y modificamos creencias y comportamiento en relación? ¿Por qué no trabajamos con los pueblos indígenas o con organizaciones indígenas directamente? ¿Cuáles son las intervenciones o los procesos previos que tenemos que hacer para construir una buena relación? No tenemos todas las respuestas, pero podríamos terminar de alguna manera con algunas palabras del presidente de Ford, Darren Walker. Creemos que explorar esas dimensiones e invitar a todos a participar en esa definición sobre todas las organizaciones de los pueblos indígenas, eso nos permitirá a nosotros estar más equipados para trabajar con los pueblos, con las comunidades y con las organizaciones étnicamente y racialmente identificadas. Y yo creo que este webinar va a dar muchos insumos en esa conversación. Entonces, quiero agradecer mucho el trabajo que ha hecho el Consejo de Investigación del Caribe Centroamericano, el trabajo que han hecho en asocio y en compañía de Entre Povos, pero quiero agradecer a las personas que van a estar en el webinar, especialmente a Lourdes, a Margaret, a Joji, a Myrna, a, a Margarita, disculpa, a Margaret, a Joji, a Myrna, a Filipo y a Margarita por todo el trabajo que han hecho acompañándonos en este proceso, porque como dije, no tenemos todas las respuestas, pero creo que esto da más luces para tener conversaciones más informadas y que nos permitan tomar mejor decisiones sobre el trabajo que promovemos. Muchísimas gracias a todos y todos.
Thank you, Sindis, for helping us to get started in a good way. It is my pleasure now to moderate the next section of this webinar by introducing the expert panelists. We're going to be starting by hearing from Joji Cariño, who is the lead person on the Weaving Relationship Building with Indigenous Peoples in Asia report. And I understand from the chat that the reports will be shared with those of you who are participating. Joji Cariño is a respected activist on Indigenous peoples' human rights, covering cultural and biological diversity and international standards on extractive industries, forests, water, energy, food, and agriculture. I'm going to be introducing the three expert panelists who author the regional reports, and then you'll be hearing from them. You will hear next from Margaret Rugadya, Dr. Margaret Rugadya, on the Philanthropy and Indigenous Peoples and Communities in Africa, Issues, Organizations, and Opportunities report. Dr. Rugadya is an African Regional Coordinator and Senior Program Officer for the tenure facility. And then last but not least, you will hear from Myrna Cunningham on the report on An Uphill Road, Philanthropy's Relationship with Indigenous Peoples in Latin America and the Caribbean. And Myrna is part of the steering group of the Pawanka Fund. She also sits on various boards, including as Vice President of the Fund for the Development of Indigenous Peoples in Latin America, and as part of the NIA Terra as a board of directors. With that, I'd like to welcome to hear Joji, please.
Thanks very much, Lourdes, and greetings to everyone. In my short presentation today, I will provide a broad overview about indigenous peoples in Asia and make some recommendations about potential responses from philanthropy towards weaving relationships with a great diversity of collective actions in the region. The linked dynamics of indigenous people's self-determination and global solidarity are urgently needed at this time of global crisis and transformational change. Asia offers a good starting point for exploring the vital role of indigenous peoples towards renewing the relationships between cultures and nature at this critical time. 411 million, or 70% of the world's indigenous peoples, live in Asia, embodying the greatest global cultural and linguistic diversity. Yet a broad understanding of Asia's indigenous peoples is lacking compared to peoples in the Amazon or, for example, North America. In Asia, there is no regional charter or mandated instrument for standard setting or oversight of states' human rights obligations, unlike Africa or even the Americas. But Asia is a region of rapid economic growth with attendant conflicts between newly modernizing states and millennial cultures and ways of living of indigenous peoples. The contrast between thinking like a state and living freely as peoples is the reality in Asia, where indigenous peoples who are variably identified as tribals, ethnic minorities, indigenous cultural communities, Adivasis, or peoples governed by custom, are still considered backward sections of the population, still to be integrated into global, regional, and national development plans and strategies. So how have indigenous peoples in Asia responded to these challenges? The Asian Indigenous Peoples Pact was established in 1992 as a social movement building effort of identifying and unifying organizations of indigenous peoples who are grounded in communities and are led by the indigenous peoples themselves. At present, AIPP has 46 members from 14 countries, including 18 national formations and many local subnational organizations, including organizations of indigenous women and indigenous youth. It has a secretariat based in Thailand with the following programs: human rights, campaigns and advocacy, environment, communications, regional capacity building, indigenous women, and organizational strengthening and movement building, which is its current priority program. Tebteba is another prominent indigenous organization addressing the need for heightened global advocacy on indigenous people's rights, convening fora on sustainable development, climate change, and traditional knowledge. Together with other indigenous peoples around the world, indigenous peoples in Asia were active in the 20-year global advocacy effort leading to the UN General Assembly adoption of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which is undoubtedly the most significant contribution of indigenous peoples around the world to global governance. Today, purposive deliberations and dialogues are needed in all Asian countries to break the dichotomy of indigenous peoples forced into isolation in the margins of mainstream societies, or forced assimilation into centralized states. Indigenous peoples' sustained struggle for cultural renewal amidst increasing domination by external governing structures is testimony to the abiding resilience of indigenous peoples and provides hopeful examples for more just and sustainable futures. Funding for indigenous peoples in Asia is a minuscule part of public multilateral and bilateral funding, including private philanthropy. Large foundations working in Asia, even in countries with large indigenous populations, have not historically targeted indigenous peoples. But more recently, Tamalpais Trust, Christian Friend Fund, have become large donors to the Asian Indigenous Peoples Pact, and together with Novo Foundation and Spring Foundation, have established the Pawanka Fund in 2014, which has provided important funding for grassroots organizations in the region. Other philanthropies include Open Society Foundation and Global Green Grants Fund. Learning from these examples, I wish to put forward some principles and recommendations. Self-determination as the fundamental tenet of the indigenous peoples movement calls for the corresponding tenet of global solidarity. For funders with a penchant for scrutiny and financial accountability, this should translate into unconditional solidarity as intentional gestures and statement of support for the collective actions of indigenous peoples, rather than the fulfillment of externally defined objectives. Thus, funding for indigenous peoples becomes more values-based and supportive of the broader freedoms, rather than the fulfillment of externally defined objectives. In the Asia report, I have made much more detailed recommendations of how to translate this into the practice of philanthropy. And I am happy to be part of this broad conversation taking place for stronger direct funding for indigenous peoples and a stronger role for philanthropy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Joji, for giving us a little bit of a glimpse of what your report is going to be covering. I wanted to just kind of respond to some of the things that you mentioned, including, sorry, apologies, I was speaking and I was muted. Thank you, Joji, for offering some of the findings that, that we have to look forward to reading the report. I just wanted to just respond to a couple of things and reiterate the need for philanthropy to support in a values-based and rights-based approach and for the self-determination of indigenous peoples, and that can look easily by supporting the priorities and their aspirations as opposed to supporting the priorities of funders of philanthropy. And to your point of the need to also have more philanthropy supporting indigenous organizations in Asia, I'm happy to share that with the great leadership of our program director, Chanda Tapa, we are going to be IFIP is going to be organizing a dialogue in Asia for in May 2023. So we look forward to maybe touching base with you, Joji, as we look at that planning. But I'd like to invite Myrna Cunningham to please join us by sharing the report in Latin America. I understand that Dr. Rugadya is in the field, and she was going to try to join from the field where she's currently in. But why don't we give the floor to Myrna, and hopefully Dr. Rugadya is going to be able to join us later on.
Thank you, Naxa. Alsutralam Kulatara Maikisna. Les saludo desde mi pueblo, el pueblo Misquito de Nicaragua, en una fecha muy importante, puesto que en esta semana estamos conmemorando 35 años de autonomía de pueblos indígenas y comunidades afrodescendientes, comunidades étnicas en la mitad de este país. Formamos parte de los más de 800 pueblos indígenas y las 60 millones de personas en lo que es América Latina y el Caribe. Pueblos con una enorme diversidad demográfica, social, territorial y política. Tenemos aproximadamente 200 pueblos en aislamiento voluntario, más de 100 pueblos transfronterizos y una creciente urbanización de pueblos indígenas, en donde hay países en donde la gran mayoría de pueblos indígenas, como Chile y Perú, son urbanos. Tenemos países con más de 300 pueblos, como es Brasil, Colombia con 102, pero también otros casos como El Salvador, con solo 3 pueblos indígenas. En nuestra región, las poblaciones indígenas continúan siendo más jóvenes que las no indígenas. Y tenemos una alta tasa de desplazamiento, migración en nuestra región. Nos organizamos de diversas formas: indígenas, campesinos, interculturales, territoriales, comunitarios, indígenas afrodescendientes, en contacto inicial, aislados. Sin embargo, también encontramos modelos organizativos interconectados. Los territorios de los pueblos indígenas en esta región contienen alrededor de 1/3 de los bosques del continente y almacenan un alto porcentaje del carbono de los bosques tropicales de todo el mundo y desempeñan un papel clave en la estabilización del clima local y regional. La relación de los pueblos indígenas se muestra a lo largo del estudio, ha estado muy vinculado al modelo de colonización que los pueblos indígenas han sufrido en esta región. Desde la doctrina del descubrimiento, que se caracterizó por relaciones de caridad entre los que tenían y los desposeídos, hasta este momento en que se identifican cambios en la filantropía, donde hay algunas organizaciones filantrópicas que están aplicando un modelo de enfoque de derechos humanos, y encontramos también expresiones de fondos liderados por indígenas que se han venido estableciendo en la región, tratando de poner sobre la mesa la práctica tradicional de reciprocidad de los pueblos indígenas. Esta nueva visión de filantropía indígena busca llevar a cabo prácticas transformadoras basadas en lo que ha sido un impulso desde IFIP, como es el respeto, la reciprocidad, la responsabilidad. Y actualmente podríamos decir que encontramos en la filantropía de nuestra región una mezcla de todas estas tendencias. Una de las características de la relación con la filantropía histórica ha sido la relación vertical, en donde se ha impuesto prácticamente apoyo para demandas, no priorizando las demandas centrales de los pueblos indígenas. El estudio trata de analizar cuáles son estas demandas centrales, y lo que se encuentra es que a lo largo de las últimas décadas los pueblos indígenas han tenido su apuesta central en la recuperación de su carácter de ser pueblos, reclamando sus derechos históricos sobre sus territorios, recursos naturales, reivindicando la libre determinación. Y más bien lo que se ve es que a lo largo del tiempo, estas demandas se han mantenido y lo que se ha visto es que se reflejan de distintas maneras, dependiendo de las relaciones que hay entre los pueblos indígenas y los distintos estados y el contexto global. Se identifican, sin embargo, 5 áreas de demandas emergentes, como son la igualdad en la diversidad, sigue siendo una demanda fuerte, demandas vinculadas a justicia ambiental, madre, tierra y territorio, la gobernanza, libre determinación y autonomía, el desarrollo libre determinado o buen vivir. Vemos también cambios, la promoción de cambios estructurales de los estados para volverlos plurinacionales o multiétnicos y el establecimiento de mecanismos para el acceso directo a los recursos, que es una demanda nueva. Los pueblos indígenas en esta región se han organizado de distintas maneras para poder tener acceso a distintos recursos. Y encontramos desde organizaciones con un enfoque sindical, movimientos, gobiernos comunales, pero también vemos organizaciones de mujeres, organizaciones religiosas, territoriales, espirituales, de personas con discapacidad, colectivos LGBT, y vemos la articulación en plataformas nacionales, mesas de diálogo y plataformas globales y regionales. Y en algunos casos, algunas plataformas temáticas. Aunque en algunos países se obliga a las organizaciones indígenas a adoptar la forma de un organismo no gubernamental para tener acceso a recursos, encontramos una enorme diferencia en el funcionamiento entre una ONG y los pueblos indígenas. Y esto responde principalmente al carácter de gobernanza colectivo que tienen las organizaciones indígenas. El informe destaca que es importante el apoyo de la filantropía a los pueblos indígenas por el aporte de los pueblos indígenas a la gobernanza global, especialmente por la contribución que hacen los pueblos indígenas a temas como el cambio climático, la protección de la biodiversidad y también la necesidad y el papel que los pueblos indígenas juegan en la construcción de un nuevo modelo democrático en la región. Las recomendaciones se orientan principalmente al apoyo a la agenda de los pueblos indígenas, a las áreas prioritarias frente al cambio climático, la justicia ambiental, las acciones de recuperación post-COVID, el cambio de relaciones de poder mediante reformas constitucionales, jurídicas e institucionales y continuar apoyando la lucha por la igualdad, la equidad y la justicia étnica racial con el propósito de responder a las desigualdades históricas. Una recomendación central es responder a las demandas crecientes de financiamiento directo a los pueblos indígenas. Entonces, se recomienda apoyar para establecer, fortalecer y consolidar los fondos o mecanismos financieros liderados por pueblos indígenas, con apoyo sustantivo para fortalecer y promover el interaprendizaje a partir de la experiencia exitosa que ya están en marcha. Las recomendaciones finales son apoyar directamente a las organizaciones de los pueblos indígenas, apostar a sus modelos propios de filantropía, financiamiento a largo plazo, apoyar la participación en los procesos de gobernanza local, conocer, acompañar, escuchar, ser flexibles. Son algunos de los planteamientos centrales y entender que la filantropía acompaña procesos de empoderamiento, pero que los pueblos indígenas se empoderan por sí mismos en la medida en que cuentan con un apoyo responsable y respetuoso. Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Doña Myrna, for sharing those powerful words and giving us a little bit of the insights into the findings. I think just a couple things that I like to elevate is, yes, I think we need philanthropy to play, I think, greater responsibility and ownership over direct funding to Indigenous organizations, Indigenous-led organizations, Indigenous-led funds, particularly as many of some have been established for quite some time, and also to support those that are emerging, both in to fund globally, but also to fund regionally. And I think something that I like to also highlight is also the importance of funding Indigenous women's organizations as part of the ecosystem of Indigenous peoples organizations that also should be receiving direct funding from philanthropy, as many of Indigenous women leaders are playing a role in critical global processes. I understand that Dr. Margaret has not been able to join us, so I'm gonna be inviting our next expert panelist, Filippo Delgato, to share with us about the Global Analysis Report, Widening the Path, an overview of philanthropy's role in supporting Indigenous peoples. Filippo, you have the floor.
So I will speak briefly. Thank you very much, Lourdes, for the introduction. And I will speak briefly about the global report. The first thing that I want to say is that the global report was inspired by the 3 regional reports prepared by Joji, Margaret, and Myrna. So I want to thank all of them, the 3 of them, for the wonderful work they did in preparing these 3 reports, and even more for the inspiration that they provided for these for the global report. Thank you very much, sincerely, to the 3 of them. Now, in the global report, we didn't try to summarize the findings of the 3 regional reports, because that would have been a very daunting task to do, because they are so rich in information, a very extensive report. So the idea of the global report is to complement and to contribute to the 3 regional reports, and to do so with slightly a more philanthropy perspective, and also a very specific objective, because it's a quite brief report. So I would like to talk a bit about the thinking behind the global report and the aim of the global report. And there is lots of evidence that suggests that there are many philanthropic organizations that are interested in supporting and working with Indigenous peoples, but they believe that they don't have the knowledge and expertise to do so. There are many people, program officers, working with philanthropic organizations that do not work yet with Indigenous people, that say that they want to do that, but they do not know where to start. And there is also a lack of appreciation about the need for their funding and the impact that it can have. This lack of appreciation has even grown in recent years, in the last 2 years. In the last 2 years, we have heard lots of high-profile pledges to support indigenous peoples around the world. In the COP of the past year, there was a pledge of $1.7 billion, for example, by several donors. And these high-profile pledges somehow having the impact that smaller foundations, small foundation, medium foundation, are doubtful about what they can do with a much smaller amount of funding. So they are somehow discouraged to participate when they hear about these big, big pledges. So these are the problems that the report tries to address and tries to contribute to their debate, if you want. And what is the thinking again in how the logic of the report? The logic is the following. We know that often individuals and organizations pay a lot of attention to suggestions and recommendations provided by peers working in similar organizations. This happens in multiple sectors. And this means that funders that are currently already working with indigenous peoples have a central role to play, a catalytic role to play in convincing other funders to enter this field of work. They can, for example, provide information about grant making to indigenous people. They clarify with the needs that it feels and helping to overcome the resistance of the inertia to enter this field of work. There is also a need to dispel some misperception about funding indigenous people. For example, that you need significant amounts of funds to have an impact, or that the granting to indigenous people can be very complex and very challenging. These are misperceptions that need to be tackled and addressed. So, considering this rationale of the report, the main aim of the report is quite narrow. The purpose is to provide information to program officers working with foundations that are already supporting indigenous people to encourage other funders to enter this field of work. And then, for example, the target audience are people like Sindis in Colombia, or Victor Illesca in Peru, in Mexico, or Erika Yamada in Brazil, and to provide them with information to convince other funders to enter this field. And this is not, of course, only referring to foundation in the north, in the global north. There are many, and a growing philanthropic sector in the global south, in many countries of the global south. And for many of these new philanthropic organizations in the global south, funding to indigenous people is something in which they have very little experience. Not all of them, but many of them. And again, this means that philanthropic institutions that have experience have a big role to play in encouraging these newer philanthropic institutions to enter this field. This is the objective of this report: provide information to foundation, to outreach to other foundations and convince them, encourage them to enter, in order to increase the number of foundations working on indigenous philanthropy. This is the thinking and the objective. Now I would like to just to talk about briefly some of the sections of the report. This is one of the sections is why is it important to fund indigenous peoples? And this is nothing new. I think many reports from IFIP have this same section and explain very well what are the reasons. And also the 3 regional reports explain very well why it is important to fund in indigenous people. So just want to highlight two points, the final 2 that you see in this slide. That private philanthropy is well situated to support and work with indigenous peoples, and the time is right to do so. There are, of course, many other arguments in the report, but I wanted to highlight just these two arguments. And then another point, which is linked to the previous one, is that private philanthropy has many comparative advantages in working with indigenous people. And these comparative advantages are highlighted and mentioned by indigenous leaders themselves when they talk about their relationship with private philanthropy. They often mention that private philanthropic institutions have more flexibility and longer-term commitments in their relationship with them. There are more direct grants with less restrictions. There is a higher level of interest in building lasting relationship with them. And there is also often, or a bit not always, a higher level of cultural awareness. And by cultural awareness, I mean the knowledge and the practice to be able to work in an environment of cultural diversity. Again, these are advantages that private philanthropy has and that are appreciated by indigenous organizations and indigenous leaders. And this goes to the point before that private philanthropy is well situated to work with indigenous people. Another section talks about indigenous organization, and Myrna just made the point, and I think Lourdes reiterated the point, that there is a need to provide more direct funding to indigenous organizations. However, this term indigenous organization, as we know very well, hides a huge diversity among indigenous organizations. There is really an expanding ecosystem of indigenous organizations. And this huge diversity is sometimes a challenge even for us to understand it and to make sense of it. So it's even a much bigger challenge for foundations that want to enter this sector of philanthropy. So this part of the report, at the risk of oversimplification, tries to help to give a preliminary understanding of this ecosystem of indigenous organization. It provides or attempts to provide a typology, an initial typology. This is not, of course, it's just initial thinking on the different kinds of indigenous organization. And we divided them in 4 main groups: the customary organization and institution. The classical example is the community assembly and all the norms that regulate the community assembly. Another example, for example, of the Maya Belize, the Maya people of Belize, is the alcalde system. These are local customary institutions that need support, of course, to function well. There are, of course, then the representative organization like AMAN in Indonesia or COICA in South America. And we consider as a separate group the women's and youth organizations, because they have, and I think this was also mentioned by Myrna, they have a crucial role to play in increasing the participation and right of these groups within the indigenous movement. And another group of organization is the so-called, what we call the indigenous service organization. And they include indigenous NGOs, indigenous law firm, and most importantly, the indigenous funds that, as also Myrna mentioned, have an increasing fundamental role to play in indigenous philanthropy. This is again a first attempt or initial attempt to describe this complexity to people that may have little knowledge about the indigenous world and the indigenous organizations. It's not exhaustive, it doesn't cover everything, but it provides some understanding and also the overlaps. The central message, of course, is that it is necessary to work with all the types of organization of this ecosystem. It's not that it's useful to focus only on representative organization or on women's organization. It is important to strengthen the entire ecosystem. This is another central message. There is also a section of global, and I won't, and it's a section from the perspective of philanthropy again. I hope you can hear me. I won't go too much in detail, but the central message is that funders interested in global governance can have a meaningful, a cost-effective impact in improving global governance if they work and they invest in indigenous people for the central role that they have in global governance. The final part is 7 recommendations that I won't detail, but that talk how and why funders can focus on and work on with indigenous people. I mentioned finally that this report focuses mainly on private philanthropy, but we of course hope that it could be a help and interesting read also for the broader donor community, as well as for indigenous organizations and indigenous leaders that want to understand more about how philanthropy may think or may approach the work with them. This is all for now. I hope that I respected my time, and it's been a pleasure to be in this panel. Thank you, Lourdes. Thank you, Lourdes.
Thank you, Filippo. I think that was a wonderful overview. This is a topic, many of the points that you touched on are topics that myself and IFIP are passionate about, particularly raising the visibility and the role of the leadership and the different value that indigenous-led funds are adding into the philanthropic ecosystem. I'm gonna be, I think we're a few minutes, but I wanted to just maybe invite our expert panelists to share a 1 minute, perhaps comment or last comment for our participants. I mean, there's so many things that are exciting about the reports that were shared today. I know IFIP is commissioning a report on the funding analysis at a global scale of funding going to indigenous-led organizations, indigenous-led funds. And that's gonna be coming out, we hope by in time for the next permanent forum, the one happening in 2023. And it'd be exciting to continue the collaboration with all of you as we work together to elevate this important topic. But with that, I'd like to turn it to Joji, Myrna, and Filippo, so if you could share it. And Sindis, please feel free to add anything from Fort's, any last thoughts. But Joji?
Yes, I'm very glad this conversation is happening. I think there are now a number of efforts and initiatives to really address direct funding for indigenous peoples. And however, they are still scattered and not really synergized, but really there are a lot of lessons. So if we want to take the next steps, obviously the first step is to begin. Let's not be afraid of it. Let's be excited by that possibility. At the COP15 in Montreal, the Forest Peoples Program will also be hosting a learning exchange among those interested to address funding for indigenous peoples. So I hope we will see each other again in these various efforts to bring our collective work together. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank all of you for the conversation, and I think it has been very important to be part of this process. to bring in this global analysis of funding for indigenous peoples. I would like to, I would say, appreciate the changes that we're seeing in philanthropy. There are positive changes, and I think this is an opportunity for indigenous peoples to really discuss at a different level the direct funding for organizations and indigenous peoples processes. And I think this study and the conversation that will follow will really help to guide that conversation, because I think that the most important thing is that funders can learn from what we are saying. We can learn from what funders are thinking, and it's important to create these spaces for exchange and learning. So thank you for the possibility, and let's continue advancing.
Is it my turn?
Yes.
Well, I would like to make a comment about which I'm not so sure, Mr. Cunningham. But I hope it's a kind of indication of future research that perhaps IFIP could be interested in. And my reflection is the following. Please correct me if you don't agree. But I think that philanthropic organization and indigenous organization are not necessarily obvious and natural partners. There are huge institutional, cultural, and political differences between them, but very, very huge. Just to mention a few, the view about the market economy, the private property, about the capitalist system could be widely different between the two groups. Despite this, there is a lot of gains to be made by them working together. It is possible to work together in a bit beneficial way, despite these cultural and political institutional differences. So what are, my question, what are the conditions that enable philanthropic institution and indigenous organization to work together without renouncing to their differences, cultural, political, and institutional? What are these conditions that could allow this without sometimes indigenous organizations feel forced to water down their political position, I suppose, in order to enter in this relationship? I don't know, Lourdes, if you have different opinions, but it's just a reflection I was willing to make. I know it's a question, but I stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for those comments. I think, Filippo, to your point, love to continue the conversation. We just in summer, we were in Australia hosting a dialogue with Australian funders and emerging Indigenous-led funds, which is all very exciting. And I think that many of the questions and the suggestions that were posed, particularly the question that was exactly the same question that I think all of you have mentioned, the importance of supporting the ecosystem of Indigenous-led organizations. It's because each has a role to play. A network of Indigenous lawyers have a role to play. A network of Indigenous youth have a role to play. Networks of Indigenous organizations have a very critical political role to play, as well as the funds. And I think in the funds, in the context that IFIP is looking at, in the conversations that is happening across philanthropic spaces like in the US, in terms of conversations around decolonizing wealth, we are thinking about this in the context of another Indigenous value of redistribution. And we see Indigenous-led funds as one of those organizations and actors that can have those conversations with philanthropy, private philanthropy. And I did see a conversation a question around how do we also influence bilaterals. And so this is just, I think we're at the start of synergies coming together. To your point, Joji, I think that's something that would be important and exciting to continue to collaborate. As IFIP, we also bring in these conversations, not only in the US philanthropy context, but I have been participating in a Latin American working group of emerging philanthropy in Latin America, and that's a very critical space to also influence, as well as other spaces where philanthropy is flowing from those who have accumulated wealth to organizations that are looking for bringing other ways of thinking in the context of climate justice, social justice, rights, and particularly in the region where I'm from, addressing discrimination and racism that continues to persist due to the history of colonization. With that, I don't know if Sindis, if you wanted to share any final words, you're welcome to open your mic. I will then turn it over to Margarita. Maybe Margarita, there were quite a few questions around the report, so maybe you can open your mic and share it to just make sure everyone is hearing from you as to how they can access the report.
Lourdes, thank you very much. Joji, thanks for your words. Filippo, Dr. Myrna, and Sindis. And thanks to all who attended the webinar, all of you who promptly responded. We know that many could not make it. There is a man happening in Indonesia and a lot of more things on the plate and every day.